My mother-in-law has a specific laugh she saves for when she thinks she's already won. It's not loud, it's the kind that stays behind closed lips. A slow exhale to her nose while her eyes do all the work. I heard that laugh for the first time at Thanksgiving dinner, 3 years into my marriage, when she slid a manila folder across the table and said, "We just thought you should understand how things actually work in this family." That folder changed everything, but not the way she intended. Let me back up. I married into the Whitfield family on a Saturday in June, which my mother-in-law later described to a family friend as a nice enough ceremony. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he is, whatever his family thinks, had warned me going in. "They have strong opinions," he said. I thought he meant about politics or food. I didn't understand yet that what he meant was about you specifically. His mother, Eleanor, ran the family the way a CFO runs a company that's quietly hemorrhaging money. All surface confidence, no transparency. His father, Robert, had built a mid-sized commercial real estate portfolio in the late 90s and spent the next 2 decades letting Eleanor manage the mythology around it. How much was it worth? Depends on who was asking and what they needed to believe. To her sister-in-law, it was comfortable. To the country club, it was significant. To me, it was frankly none of your business, sweetheart. I was a paralegal. I want to be honest about that because Eleanor certainly was. She brought it up the way some people bring up weather, casually, just to fill space. She's in legal work, she'd say at dinner parties, which technically wasn't wrong, but the emphasis she put on, she's made it land like a gentle insult. Her son had a finance degree. Her daughter Brooke had done 3 years of medical school before pivoting to wellness consulting, which Eleanor described as essentially the same thing. Me being a paralegal who read contracts for a living was, in Eleanor's taxonomy, decorative. What I actually did for 8 years before any of this happened was read the fine print that other people skipped. I caught errors in lease agreements. I flagged clauses that looked standard but weren't. My supervising attorney once told me I had the most useful kind of attention, the kind that notices what's conspicuously absent. I thought about that a lot during the 2 years after my father-in-law had his stroke. Robert had the stroke on a Wednesday morning in March. He survived, but the recovery was slow and the cognitive effects were real. He could hold a conversation. He knew who we were. But the man who had quietly kept Eleanor's more aggressive instincts in check, the man who had, I later learned, told her more than once to leave the girl alone, that version of him didn't fully come back. Eleanor moved fast. Within 4 months of the stroke, she had transferred primary management of 3 of the family's properties into a new LLC. Within 6 months, she'd restructured the family trust, a trust that Robert had established in 2003, that named their 2 children and any future spouses as beneficiaries. I didn't know about the trust restructure when it happened. My husband didn't either, not fully. Eleanor told him it was just administrative cleanup, and because he was exhausted from flying back and forth to help with his father's rehabilitation, he didn't push. I found out by accident. We were visiting for my father-in-law's birthday, his first birthday after the stroke, and Eleanor had gone to impressive lengths to make it feel normal. Catered dinner. The good china. Brooke flew in from Portland with her boyfriend. I spent most of the evening sitting with Robert, showing him photos on my phone from the trip my husband and I had taken to the Oregon coast. He smiled at the one of the sea stacks. He kept touching the screen like he was trying to hold on to it. At some point, I went to find the bathroom and took a wrong turn and ended up in Robert's home office, which had been turned into a kind of staging area for paperwork. There were boxes, a scanner, and on the desk, not in a folder, just sitting there, a document with the words Amendment to Declaration of Trust across the top. I'm a paralegal. I read it. I stood in that office for 4 minutes. I know because my phone screen kept timing out and I kept unlocking it to keep reading. The amendment had been signed 7 months earlier. Robert's signature was on it. Shaky, uneven, completely unlike the crisp signature I'd seen on birthday cards for 3 years. The amendment removed the spouse designation from the beneficiary language. It also added a provision that gave Eleanor sole discretionary authority over distributions during any period in which a primary beneficiary was incapacitated or otherwise limited in decision-making capacity. There was a handwritten notepaper clipped to the back, Eleanor's handwriting. It said R, approve and DAR. Verbal confirm 3/13/14, signed 3/21. March 14th was 6 days after the stroke. I put the document down. I went back to the party. I ate the birthday cake and I helped Robert blow out his candles. And I smiled at Eleanor across the table and I did not say a single word. Because I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I opened my mouth. Here's what I understood by the end of that night. My husband's inheritance. Money his father had specifically set aside for him. Money Robert had mentioned to my husband by name more than once. Had been quietly redirected. Not stolen in a dramatic sense. Restructured. Administratively cleaned up. And the signature authorizing it had been obtained from a man 6 days out of a major neurological event. I also understood something else. Eleanor had no idea what I did for a living. Not really. She knew the word paralegal the way you might know the word accountant as a job title without content, a category without teeth. She had never once asked me a specific question about my work. She had never in 3 years asked me anything more specific than how's the commute. That was her mistake. I spent the next 3 months being very, very quiet. I requested copies of the original trust documents through my husband. I told him I wanted to understand the family finances better, which was true, and he thought it was sweet that I was trying to be more engaged, which I let him think. I pulled property records. I found the LLC filing. I found the registered agent. I found the amendment date and cross-referenced it with Robert's hospital discharge records, which I obtained through my husband who had medical power of attorney and didn't know yet why I was asking. Discharge date, March 19th. Signature on the amendment, March 21st, 2 days out of the hospital. I called an estate attorney, not through work, privately, a woman I'd been referred to by a colleague who specialized in elder law. I laid out everything I had. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How long ago did this happen?" I told her. She said, "And the original trust? Do you have a copy of that?" I did. She said, "Okay. I need you to listen carefully because what you're describing, if the documentation supports it, is undue influence, potentially financial elder abuse. That's not a civil dispute. That's a crime." I went home that night and made dinner and didn't say anything to my husband because I didn't know yet how to say it. He loved his mother the way people love complicated things. Not without awareness, but without wanting to look directly at what they're aware of. I needed to be careful, not because I was afraid of him, because I loved him and I knew this was going to break something, and I wanted to make sure what broke was the right thing. I told him on a Sunday morning in October, sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread out between our coffee cups. He didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at his father's signature. That uneven, struggling signature, and I watched something move across his face that I didn't have a word for then. I have one now. It was the specific grief of recognizing something you had felt but refused to name. "She told me it was administrative," he said. "I know." She said Dad had reviewed everything. "I know," as she said. He looked up. "How long have you known?" 3 months. I needed to be sure. He nodded slowly. He picked up the paper-clipped note in Eleanor's handwriting, R approved. Verbal confirm 314, and he read it twice. Then he put it down very carefully, the way you put down something fragile. "What do we do?" he asked. "We go see the attorney," I said. "And then we go see your father." Robert was having a good week when we visited. He was in his favorite chair in the sunroom with a crossword he'd been working on for 3 days. My husband sat across from him and I sat beside him, and for a few minutes we just talked about the crossword, about a documentary he'd been watching, about whether the Mariners had any shot this season. Then my husband said, "Dad, I need to ask you something about the trust." Robert put the crossword down. My husband asked gently and directly whether Robert remembered signing an amendment to the family trust in March of last year. Robert looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "She said it was just keeping things current." He paused. "I signed something. I didn't. I was very tired." He stopped. His hands resting on the crossword tightened slightly. I don't remember what it said. My husband looked at me. I looked at him. "That's okay, Dad," my husband said. "That's okay." We filed with the estate attorney 2 weeks later. The legal process is long, and I won't pretend otherwise. There were depositions. There were requests for financial records that Eleanor resisted and then, under court order, produced. There was a forensic accountant who went through the LLC transactions and found that in 14 months, a total of $340,000 in distributions that should have flowed to the trust had been redirected to an account Eleanor controlled. Not all at once. Quarterly. In amounts that looked, individually, like routine management fees. There was also the matter of the notary. The amendment to the trust had been notarized. Standard process. But the notary, a woman Eleanor had used for various documents over the years, had notarized the signature on March 21st, 2 days after Robert's hospital discharge. The estate attorney subpoenaed the notary's log. The notary, to her credit, told the truth. Eleanor had called her to the house. Robert had been present. She had witnessed the signature. But she had not, she admitted, had any substantive conversation with Robert about what he was signing or confirmed his comprehension of the document's contents. She had been told it was a routine update. Eleanor's attorney tried to frame it as good faith estate planning. The forensic accountant's report made that difficult. The notary's testimony made it harder. Robert's medical records, his cognitive assessment from March 15th, 6 days after the stroke, which documented significant short-term memory impairment and reduced executive function, made it very nearly impossible. The case settled before trial. I want to be clear about what settled means here, because Eleanor tried to tell Brooke it meant both sides agreed to disagree. What it actually meant was this: the trust amendment was invalidated. The original trust language, including the spousal beneficiary designation, was restored. Eleanor was required to repay the $340,000 in redirected distributions with interest into the trust. She retained her role as trustee, but under the supervision of an independent co-trustee appointed by the court who reviews all distributions and has veto authority. She also had to pay her legal fees. The day the settlement was finalized, I was in my car in the parking garage of our attorney's office building. My husband was inside handling the final paperwork. I sat there with my hands in my lap, and I thought about that Sunday morning 3 years earlier when Eleanor had slid that manila folder across the Thanksgiving table, just so you understand how things actually work, and how sure she had been, in that moment, that I was the kind of woman who would nod and go back to her side dish. I thought about the way she said she's in legal work at parties, the faint emphasis, the gentle dismissal. I thought about Robert in his sunroom with his crossword puzzle saying I was very tired with his hands tight on the page. Then I thought about something my supervisor told me years ago, early in my career, when I was frustrated about a contract dispute that seemed obvious to me but was being dismissed. She said, "The most powerful thing you can do in a room is understand it better than everyone else in it and let them keep talking." I thought about that for a while. Eleanor and I don't have a relationship now. I think she expected that the settlement would smooth over eventually, that family gravity would pull things back to a surface-level function. For my husband's sake, we show up to events. We are polite, but something is different in the room when she and I are in it, and I think she feels it. I know what I know. I see what I see. Brooke called me about 4 months after the settlement. She was processing, I think, trying to find a version of events that let her love her mother without fully reckoning with what her mother had done. She said, "I just feel like you approached this very adversarially." I said, "Your father's signature was obtained 2 days after he left the hospital from a stroke." She was quiet. I said, "I didn't approach it any particular way. I read the document." She said she needed time, and I said that was fine, and we haven't talked since. I hope she figures out what she needs to figure out. That's genuinely true. My father-in-law called me last month. He does that occasionally now, short calls, usually in the afternoon when he's been doing the crossword and feels like talking. He said he'd been thinking about everything that had happened. He said, "I want you to know that I'm grateful." He paused for a long moment. I didn't understand what was being done around me. I think I knew something was wrong and I didn't have the words for it. I said, "You don't have to thank me." He said, "I know I don't have to. I wanted to." After we hung up, I sat with that for a while. The version of me who showed up to that first Thanksgiving with a bottle of wine and too much hope wouldn't have known what to do at this moment. She was trying so hard to be someone Eleanor would approve of. She thought that was the goal. But there's a version of respect that has nothing to do with approval. It's the kind you build quietly, in the margins of documents, in the fine print that other people skip. It's the kind that shows up when it's needed and doesn't need to announce itself beforehand. Eleanor wanted me to understand how things work in this family. Now she does. I think about Eleanor's laugh a lot. That quiet, nose-exhale laugh she used when she already thought she'd won. I've tried to understand it, not to forgive it, but to understand it. Because what she did didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of operating in a world where she had decided early on who mattered and who was decorative. And once you make that decision about a person, you stop paying attention to them. You stop asking questions. You assume. That assumption was the thing that undid her. Not me. Not the attorney. Not the court. Her own certainty that I was not worth understanding. There's a version of this story where I stay quiet, where I put that document down in Robert's office, walk back to the birthday party, eat the cake, and decide it isn't my fight. I understood that version. I felt the pull of it. It would have been easier, at least for a while. Easier on my marriage. Easier on Thanksgiving. Easier on the complicated, fragile thing that is a family held together partly by love and partly by the agreement not to say certain things out loud. But Robert signed that document 2 days out of the hospital. His hand was shaking. He said, months later, I was very tired. And I think the thing that made it impossible for me to stay quiet wasn't outrage. It was something quieter than that. It was the knowledge that I could see what had happened, and that seeing it and saying nothing would make me complicit in it. That's not a legal standard. That's just an internal one, the kind you can't negotiate your way out of. What I've come to believe is that how we act when we think no one is watching, or when the person watching us doesn't seem to count, is the truest version of who we are. Eleanor believed I didn't count. She was wrong about that, but more than that, she was wrong to believe it about anyone. The moment you decide another person's understanding doesn't matter, you've handed them an advantage you don't even know you've given. I spent 3 months building something in silence. Not out of strategy, though strategic. Out of care. I cared about Robert. I cared about my husband. I cared about doing something right, the right way, with enough evidence that it couldn't be dismissed as a daughter-in-law with an axe to grind. That patience, the kind that stays still while it's paying very close attention, isn't something I was born with. I built it in years of reading contracts other people skipped. It turns out those are the same skill. I'm not telling this story because Eleanor lost. I'm telling it because Robert called me last month to say thank you, and I heard in his voice something I hadn't heard before. Not gratitude exactly, but relief. The relief of a man who had felt something was wrong and hadn't had the words, and now the record reflected the truth. That's what this was really for. Not the settlement. Not the legal fees. The record. The truth, documented in the right hands at the right time. That's the thing that holds. Everything else is just paperwork.